Welcome to the Underwater Podcast, where we take a deep dive into the world of underwater portrait photography, cinematography, and everything in between. With me, your host, Brett Stanley. Welcome back to the Underwater Podcast, and this week we're putting on our virtual reality headsets and chatting with Sapp, a pioneer in underwater VR. Casey's company Virtual designs and builds some of the most amazing camera arrays for capturing 180 and 360 degree underwater experiences. We chat about how he got started in the industry and some of the very cool clients he's had. There is a bit of technical jargon in this episode, but you should be fine to follow along without knowing all the terms. Alright, let's dive in, virtually. Casey, welcome to the Underwater Podcast.
It's good to be here, Brett. Good to meet you virtually.
Yeah, I mean, everything's virtual these days, which is kind of a really apt way of introducing you because you are the CEO of Virtual Incorporated.
It was a cool name 5 years ago, and I am the CEO of Virtual. That's right. So Virtual is my strength, and I'm glad to be here.
So what is underwater virtual reality? I mean, that's kind of what your life is right now, I guess. Well, from the last few years that I've known of you, it's been building these underwater virtual reality cameras and everything that goes along with that. Do you want to talk us through what that actually means for your day-to-day?
Yeah, so I live in Encinitas, San Diego, and I've been here for about 7 years. And just the quick pitch today is that Virtual stands for Virtual Reality Technology Underwater Limited. We focus on multi-camera, prototype, typically one-of-a-kind housing designs. Right. And our focus has been, over the last couple of years, very, very high-end, high-resolution, tons of cameras, very, very heavy, large camera technology. And this has been used in theme parks, dome projections, virtual reality experiences, and what's considered mixed reality all over the world. So our clients over the last 10 years have been Google, Facebook, Oculus, SeaWorld, even space companies, because if you can do it underwater, you can do it in space.
Yeah. So for me, like growing up, like virtual reality kind of meant terrible graphics and, you know, like a sort of a headset, but you'd be in a virtual world. But for you guys, and maybe this is how the term is used these days, it's more like 360 degree cameras and stuff, right? Like it's not you're not generating fake worlds. You're actually bringing the real world to people via headsets. Is that right?
It's a dream, and the dream is the holodeck, and we do want photoreal, multi-sensory experiences, but there are a lot of hardware and software limitations to do that. And I think about 6 years ago, virtual reality has come and gone over the last couple of decades, even in the 50s and 60s. And then there was an excitement in the 90s with Lawnmower Man. And then it came back in 2015 with Chris Milk and his company Verse, which I riffed off of with my company. His company was VRSE and mine is VRTUL. And he has some really interesting TED Talks, and he really inspired a new generation of immersive filmmakers. And VR years in this industry are a little bit like dog years. And there have been a number of companies which have come and gone over the last 5 to 6 years, but a few have remained, and a few have really found their niche and professionalized, and they're doing training, they're doing camera engineering, volumetric. There's a lot of definitions and a lot of terminology that falls into the immersive space. And the way I like to explain it is that in English, there's one word for snow, but the Eskimos have 100. And there's wet snow, there's yellow snow, there's dark snow, there's drinkable snow. And so VR it's an all-encompassing term for what is immersive. And people can use mixed reality, ultimate reality, there's XR, there's AR. But the focus of today and the focus of our conversation is really about 180, 360, both monoscopic and stereoscopic experiences,
Right.
which can feel like they are photoreal.
Yeah. So you guys are not taking any kind of like computer generated graphics. You're not kind of creating any worlds. You're just taking what you're capturing in the real world with your cameras and then stitching it all together for the viewers. You're not really kind of creating anything that's not already there.
That's right. Yeah, my company's focus isn't about heavy CG experiences. There are a lot of really great VFX studios out there. We've been focused on live action and really capturing what is real. There are CG elements. Ironically, these shoots are very, very VFX heavy. You have to go into the mindset in these productions of what is going to need to be rotoed, what's going to need to be painted, composited, the different depths. You're looking at these productions in terms of frames. So ironically, while it is live action, the best techs and camera ops have a visual effects understanding to because if something gets too close to the cameras, you have to recreate it and then you're back to CG again.
And so that's what you're doing. So it's the post production, just kind of making it work in terms of what you've recorded, as opposed to adding something in that possibly wasn't already there.
Right. Yeah. So the multi-camera world it's to me, I think it's a different world entirely than traditional video or photo. It's kind of a third medium. There are some major differences with multi-camera productions than normal productions, and there's some benefits too. I think I'll just list out some of the differences and we can go from there. But
Yeah.
for one, there's tons of data. So when you're doing these high-end professional productions, the cameras are shooting 100 gigabytes a minute, 200 gigabytes a minute, and you have to go in with the mindset that post-production is really the most expensive part of this whole process. Shooting in the second is if one camera goes out, if one camera fails, the shot fails. So everything needs to be bulletproof from end to end. And you can't recreate a camera. If it's gone, then you need to go back to the drawing board. Another thing is that I'm finding compared to like a traditional high-end maybe movie shoot with A-list actors, in this multi-camera underwater space, there are actually some concessions which you have to make with top-of-the-line cameras like an ARRI or even a Monstro. And it's not always budgetary reasons, it's the size of the camera. And the larger the camera, the harder it is to stitch. So even if I had an infinite amount of money, the stitching, if it's impossible or if there's too much parallax, then you can't finish the job. And
Right.
so there's this really weird set of trade-offs that you have to make, even with a large budget, that you need to choose these square modular cameras like a Zcam E2 or a Blackmagic Micro Studio or Micro Cinema if you're going to do something that's high resolution. And even the Red Komodo now, it's unfortunately just a little bit too large, and we've looked at it extensively. So it's a really interesting. And then another thing is that when you're shooting, you're shooting towards the horizon. You're not pointing. You're not looking up. You're not looking down. You're not trying to chase something. You're literally trying to catch ambient scenes, and the framing has to happen either in post or it has to happen, with the talent itself. The camera
Right.
doesn't really play a lot into that. And then lighting. The lighting is a whole different problem, and having the diver in frame because the cameras capture everything and the cameras capture the lights. So trying to figure out how to paint those out or roto those or is sometimes a concession which people aren't comfortable making financially. And
Yeah.
and so oftentimes people shoot with little to no light and just ambient footage. So that's kind of the major differences in the lens that we see this medium and how we plan productions.
So there's a lot to unpack in that. And for people that don't know really what VR and 360 kind of looks like from a technical point of view. It's an array of cameras, right? So like if you're doing a 180, you might have like, I don't know, what, two or more cameras set up so that they're looking in different directions and recording all that scene in 180 degrees. And then you can stitch that footage together to make an immersive, controllable environment for the viewer. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's important for me to give respect and reference the pioneers of really big, large camera systems like Howard Hall and Bob Cranston. And I don't know if you're familiar with the history of the IMAX underwater camera. It was almost a ton. It only shot for 3 minutes, and these guys had to figure out how to travel with this thing all over the world to capture behaviors and shoot, what we know and love in all of the domes and planetariums around the world. And so once the technology got up to 8K sensors, the helium and Monstro were used for a lot of these planetarium experiences in large format, sometimes in up-res with the weapon or some type of 5K or 6K camera. But now we're getting into this space where LED technology is outpacing the camera systems.
Oh, right.
So,
Yeah.
so what we're finding is that you do shoot 180, and there are single camera systems that can shoot 180, but they can't shoot 180 at 15K or 20K or RAW or 60 frames a second. So there are different arrays, different configurations, 360, 180, 200, maybe a large vertical resolution, small horizontal, a wide horizontal resolution, maybe like 20 or 30K by 3K.
Yeah.
And there's a number of different configurations that we create based on how the display technology works.
Right. And are you basically setting up the camera configurations and everything, knowing where it's going to be presented?
That's right. We work with the end in mind, and it's really hard to make do it all camera system for the budgets or for the display. For example, and I know we're getting very technical very fast, but I think it's important to differentiate how different this medium is.
Yeah, go for it.
if I have a project that's over 20K.
Oh,
It
right.
actually is about 20K by 3K. And I actually have to shoot with the unprocessed cameras over 60K because of the lenses and how much pixel loss happens on the sensor, the convergence between the images, and a number of other things that happen downstream. You're losing an insane amount of data from start to finish. And and so when you're shooting that's with 60K or 70K in order to get a 20K image, you really have to think about the display and if it's going to be worth it, because you don't want to overdo it if you don't have to.
So what sort of projects have you guys been doing? Like you're talking about big 20K displays and stuff. What is the range of clients that you have?
We have a couple of buckets, and the buckets range from very fast turnaround social media, 360 experiences, and virtual reality headsets. There are video apps if you go into a headset where you can watch these different immersive stories, and there's new live streaming platforms that are coming out and long form storytelling that's releasing. We have a dome set of clients which want to do very, very sharp edge to edge 8K experiences.
And when you say dome, you mean kind of like going into like a planetarium sort of
It could
environment?
be, yeah, or a little bit even larger, maybe something that is almost spherical in nature, that even it's almost like walking into a soap bubble,
Oh,
something
wow.
like that. So a
Yeah.
dome could be something that is spherical in nature, which could be 180 degrees or it could be 250 or 300 degrees.
Right.
And then you have these large LED displays which are flat and maybe have different curvatures, but they aren't meant for a headset. They're not meant to be immersive. They're just massive.
Right.
And so you build the camera system and the workflow to those budgets because each one is very, very different.
Yeah. I mean, it must be very interesting to kind of get a client and come to you with a project and then work out how to build a camera to fit that. Because you do everything bespoke, right? Like everything is custom mostly for each client.
That's right. So in 2015, I started this company, and I had this idea to do a software app, that a mobile app that was like the YouTube for immersive experiences. And very quickly I realized that was a poor idea. And I saw that people were making money doing these immersive productions, and that no one really had any idea how to do it, and that everyone was just making it up and throwing themselves off as the experts. And so I I was like, okay, if we're gonna make money, maybe this is the way to go. It's just building camera arrays. And I hired a guy from Legend named Matthew DeJohn, who was an amazing generalist. He could do anything from help 3D print the arrays to help build post-production workflows. He's at Blackmagic now. And we started to pitch these very, very high quality 3D 360 experiences. And then we began to concept underwater 3D arrays. And very quickly, the opportunities that became available to us were to build these arrays with GoPros and with 3D printed mounts, and just jump in and just see what we could capture. And everyone was trying new things, and so we were getting paid to R&D, and being in the water and getting paid to innovate was a dream come true. And then we got to the point where we were asked to do a full 360 3D production in 2016. And we had to build arrays with over 30 GoPros. And
Good Lord.
processing that footage and synchronizing it was so much of a headache. We said, if we ever do this again, we are going to hire and find the best camera engineer to
Right.
help us build something. And so we very painfully got through it. It ended up being a successful theme park attraction at SeaWorld San Diego for a few years.
Oh, great.
And and then we hired a guy named Jeremy Childress. And Jeremy Childress to me is one of the best marine engineers in the world. He's based in Oregon. He runs a company called the Sexton Corporation. And over the last few years, Matt has transitioned out. Jeremy has become my partner. And what we do is we really blend the creative and the technical to do bespoke systems. And Jeremy has the machine shop, he has the marine engineers, he has the assembly, he has the wherewithal for networking and electrical. And through that, we've been able to build these systems very quickly, very rapidly, and very successfully for a number of clients.
That's so cool. So you're actually having to design these camera arrays, but then also design the housings to go around them. Does that change your restrictions on what you can do in terms of laying out the array?
It does. I think a lot of people think that what you can do above water, you can do below water. And things become very heavy very quickly. They become hot very quickly. They grow in size. They become hard to travel with. And trying to take maybe a certain lens above water, a fisheye lens that people really like using, doesn't necessarily work underwater, or you lose too many pixels beyond the 180, because a lot of domes don't go beyond that. And
Yeah.
there are a lot of different rules in marine engineering and development that people take for granted, and they think that you can just put a camera in some type of aluminum box and it's going to work. And even the optics around fixed focus lenses, and it is a completely, it's a world where people spend their whole careers specializing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so I'm by no means the expert in any of these areas. I'm lucky to hire really, really amazing and talented guys to develop custom underwater optics and help figure out, where the focus ranges are. But it's a different world than single cam productions and definitely terrestrial productions.
Oh yeah, totally. Because you've got so many different factors. Like you talk about, you've got the size of things, you've got the weight of things, and it's not like you can just build a big like glass bubble and fill it full of cameras, because then how are you going to move that around and how are you going to sync it? So there's all these sorts of things to keep in mind.
We've had a number of people over the years ask us to try and put the Nokia Ozo underwater, or the Insta360 camera, which is this spherical ball integrated camera with a really nice tight post-production workflow. But because they're fixed focus lenses, you would have to build this fishbowl type of almost aquarium that's 3 or 4 feet large, custom glass. Figure out how to travel with that. Figure out how to control the camera, keep it buoyant, and keep it from overheating. And not to mention, you actually can see the reflections of these cameras when you do these bubble housings. And
Right.
it's a mess. So what we've done is, the way we think about it is custom camera arrays, where you treat all of the cameras like one camera. The old method of doing underwater 360 and even terrestrial level stuff was, you set all of the cameras to the same setting. There's no global control system. You press record on all of them. You clap sync. Maybe you do some type of audio sync, and then you run them till the cameras die. And what we take the approach of doing is, if we had to do that, as a career, we would. I'd rather be doing something different than just pressing record and stopping all these all
Yeah,
these
yeah.
cameras. And
Yeah.
so what we try to do is we try to build mini computers, Raspberry Pis, mini GPUs. It depends on the system, where we can get a preview that represents all of the cameras. We can see all of the cameras running, and we press, when we do an exposure setting or an f-stop change, they all change. And when we're recording judiciously. We're not running them, these 1 terabyte SSDs or 512 gigabyte CFast cards till the end, because that would just take weeks to be able to review the footage. So what we try to do is we try to limit the record times and speed up the stitched preview turnarounds to within a few hours or a day.
Oh, right.
And that is as close as we can possibly get to the way that folks in Hollywood and doing A-list productions can get. It's you can't really get more than a single preview of one camera, or even a stitch preview underwater. And it's different. It's just different.
And so, are you saying that you do get a stitched preview while you're down there, or you're not?
No, it takes a very, very heavy GPU process with like an NVIDIA 1080 card, and like what's considered a VR ready computer, and to put that in its own enclosure is a huge pain. And so what we try, if we were to do a live stitch feed to the surface, which there's a lot of projects that are coming onto the scene to do that, you really want to do all of the heavy GPU processing at the surface. But if you're just going to do something that's self-contained, blue chip natural history, run and gun, you're just looking at individual camera feeds and then doing all the processing later and seeing if you got it. Yeah.
So, if you're operating the camera under the water, are you just kind of, before you start recording, obviously, do you just cycle through all the cameras and make sure they're all recording and everything's good, and then?
Oh man, every time the camera moves from the hotel room to the dock to the boat to underwater, you're checking.
Yeah.
You're trying to figure out, is this thing still working? Is everything still plugged in?
Yeah.
Because one movement of a cable is the difference of the whole array, like I said, working or not working. There is constant review, constant self checks, maintenance, support, and there's a methodology we've refined over the last few years to ensure it's bulletproof, and we've been successful. But I had this project about 5 years ago with Michael Muller, and he's a well-known photographer in the Hollywood space who does a lot of movie posters and works with celebrities. And he's a great underwater photographer as well, very passionate. And he wanted to go on this worldwide tour of hitting 10 or 12 destinations and creating a series called Into the Now. We were a little bit early on in our professional camera making experience, and we went with the Blackmagic micro studio cameras, which had an external recorder. I don't know if you are familiar with that camera. It
Not
didn't
personally,
have
no.
it was a 4K 30 frames per second ProRes 422 camera, which at that time was the best camera available for these types of rigs, but it only did external recording. So you had these flimsy little cables that attached the data to the sensor. And sure enough, Michael was patient and he was, resilient, and we figured out over time how to handle this. But every time the boat hit a wave, one of the cables would come out. And so we were doing surgery on these cameras constantly on the boat in hot, moist air,
Right.
in the sun. And it was so painful.
And so you got to crack open the housing and find the cable that's missing and put it back in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can't glue it. You can't solder it. I mean, there was so many things we learned through that process, which has informed other designs, especially in the natural history and run and gun space. And those cameras still have a special place in my heart, and I'm glad. It's been 4 years or so since we did that production. I think it's about to release in the next couple weeks to headsets and online, and we'll wait to see how it all comes out. But you learn, and sometimes those learnings are very, very painful.
Yeah. And I think probably quite a steep learning curve too, because you're doing things that probably no one else could really advise you on. So you've got to learn these things yourself.
There's no podcasts like the Underwater podcast. There's no YouTube playlists. There's no speaking events. We just had to learn and fail. And failing fast and failing forward has been the mantra for the last half decade. And we've been fortunate to fall into bigger and bigger projects, and we can tell very, very quickly if a certain camera or if a certain type of production is gonna work or gonna be successful, and we want to put ourselves in position to help the people which are really doing the pioneering creative work. We want to go alongside them technically.
Yeah, exactly. It reminds me a lot of there's a documentary called Chasing Coral that I saw. I think it was a Netflix thing, came out a couple of years ago, I think. And for the documentary, they wanted to document the bleaching of the coral, and they wanted to build these cameras that could sit, time-lapse cameras that could sit on the reef and basically document the dying of that reef. But they had all these troubles of, they had these glass domes, but the domes would start to cover with algae, and how do you clean them? And they built these self-cleaning systems and all this sort of stuff. And I think they had a couple of times where, they set these up, set the time lapse going, come back I don't know, like a month later, and it hadn't even worked. And it was just a month wasted because they can't keep checking it all the time, Do you come up against those sorts of big problems, or are you basically there the whole time, aren't you? Like operating the camera, so you've got a pretty decent.
The algae problem is definitely a known problem with a lot of the time lapse stuff, and we see a really an interesting breadth of clients. We have clients working in salmon farms. We have scientists doing deep sea exploration. We just deployed a multi-camera system for 6,000 meters on the new Ocean X boat.
Wow.
And they're doing live streaming and trying to help the pilots with their navigation.
Like a personed mission, or is it an ROV?
It's both. The system was developed in such a way that it would shoot 360 and the submersible pilot could control it, and we could capture that uncompressed and post-process it later, or we could do a live stream a compressed live stream from miles down
Oh, okay.
and on an unmanned vehicle to view and analyze and diagnose and do all the different things that scientists like to do, which are in the deep sea. So it's used for both, and we chose the Zcam because it's both a great live streaming camera and a great small good value solution that shoots 60 frames per second 4K raw. And there aren't many. It's kind of a it's a magical camera right now in the space, frankly, and we're really happy about it. So yeah, so we have salmon farms, we have folks who are on fishing trawlers, we have folks who are sending these cameras into space, we have Hollywood, we have military, and Jeremy and I share these different clients and projects and work on them together. And there's findings and learnings from each of them. And we don't have the algae problem in Hollywood, most certainly, but we do have the problem of high data rates and a tremendous amount of footage that you have to process quickly.
Right.
And that's something which is useful more and more for what's a new avenue called light field or volumetric capture. It's how do you get this data through the pipes so that you can actually do something with it almost in real time. And doing it underwater is 10 times as hard.
And so volumetric, I mean, you speak about the light field stuff, and that's basically kind of mapping an area based on the way the light comes back to the camera. Like you can actually kind of get a 3D representation of the scene. Is that right?
There's a small difference between light field and volumetric, and you're referring to light field. And the major difference is just data and how many cameras are capturing something. But if you can get a mesh and a texture and the volume of an object, you are doing something which is volumetric. And that's you can see those models on Sketchfab, you can use them for measurement. They can go into Unreal engines or game engines and for different types of work. And then light field is the next step up, and we're not quite there yet. And it's actually getting the most photoreal representation of an object. And
Right.
it's an insane amount of data, and trying to do something which is bigger than a tennis ball is its own unique problem. And there's a couple guys around the world who are really pushing this medium forward. We're can't talk too much about who those people are, but light field above water is hard. Light field below water is even harder.
Yeah.
But if you want to digitally preserve something, or if you want to see something in the most accurate representation, light field is the dream. That's the goal. But if
Right.
you can just get a mesh and a texture and at least kind of see how that thing looks and maybe add animation and movement to it later, that's great too. And a lot of people have use for that.
So let's talk about your post production, because I mean you're taking all this raw footage, which I guess has a pretty decent dynamic range, and then you need to create that into a stitch file, which basically means that if you are using a VR headset, you can turn around and it looks seamless, like there's no joins. How does that work for you if you've got like 360 and you're underwater and you're looking through a plexiglass dome? What's involved?
So the typical methodology and post-production process for raw high resolution footage is you capture it, you offload it with Thunderbolt 3 or some of the NVMe drives, and you try to get that off as quickly as you possibly can. You take those clips and you throw them through a software called, and this is the 180 and 360 workflow, and you put those into Mystica, which is an optical flow stitching software, and you pump out 4K low res files with a LUT on them to review. You figure out, did all the cameras work? What are the frames that you want to work with? What's going to make it in the edit? What do you need to throw away? And you can review those in a headset. You can review those in spherical video players. You can just view them as just an equirectangular file. From there, you take that and put it into an editing software, Adobe or something, or DaVinci, and you start to make the edit and you start to make the story, and you add, the audio and some of the high level kind of previs CG work or graphics. And then once you've chosen the frames that you want to work with and you decide, the exact selects, then you hand those to a VFX house or someone who knows how to do the post processing and the real fine stitching, which can be done in Mystica or Nuke or Fusion with which is owned by Blackmagic, and get into the heavy roto and paint and stabilization that's needed to make these things look pixel perfect. And then you render out the file at whatever resolution you need and save the masters. And so it's very similar to a VFX workflow where you're just working with frames and
Yeah.
you only want to touch the frames that are important and just throw everything else out, because it's every frame is multiplied by 12 cameras or 20 cameras or however many, and and trying to even review those, like edits on them, is an extra step and an extra amount of time. Because if you're gonna, for example, if you need to review an edit of an 8K file and you need to review that 10 times, like how fast do you think you're going to be able to get that done? You need to allow the necessary time, a couple weeks or months, to view, make fixes, review, make fixes, and it's like a heavy CG movie,
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
I mean, it can't be done quickly.
No, it's very detail oriented and very, I guess, tedious. But it's you've got to get in there with a fine tooth comb and make sure it all works, because it's so much data and it's such a wide viewing angle, I guess.
Yeah, people notice the pops, they notice the stitch lines, they notice the errors.
Yeah.
Their eyes are drawn to that. And you need to make a multitude of cameras look like one, and it's not an easy process. And so the magic, is really not about the cameras. You would think that if you build the most ideal array that everything's going to work downstream. It's just not true. The magic is having very informed, experienced subject matter experts at each step who are going to identify problems, deal with them. And for example, just as one story, when we were working on that 60 GoPro SeaWorld project, we tried to outsource some of the post-production work where they do all the template creation and stitching. And there was a VFX house we were working with that was throwing 50 or 60 people at a single shot, and they weren't getting it to look right.
Oh wow.
And we were quite disappointed. And what we realized is they didn't know how to actually align the cameras correctly at the very first step and do the template creation. So they were having to do an extra amount of roto and comp and paint to make up for that. Whereas we found someone and we brought someone in house who did the template creation correctly, and we were able to turn these scenes around in a couple days. So with one person. So it really matters who the people are that you bring in and who the team is. Otherwise, you won't finish.
I mean, because it is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, right? If you don't know what that jigsaw puzzle is meant to look like, how do you even know how to start?
100% accurate. You nailed it. That's exactly right.
That's awesome, dude. And so, in terms of operating these cameras, like if you are the underwater operator for one of these projects, what are the range of things you have to do? Is it just like a normal camera operator and they're just basically running through the scene, or have they got to keep things in mind while they're down there?
So the first thing is that, as you've probably heard in underwater podcasts, is the diving has to be just spot on.
Yeah.
The experience has to be just a known quantity. And I typically am not going to work with guys who don't already have rebreather experience or at least 1,000 or a couple thousand dives under there. And then it's important that they have camera op experience with Reds or high-end cinema cameras, so that they actually understand how to get the most out of these cameras. That in and of itself is is kind of hard to find, actually. And then having a team member which you enjoy and can spend time with, and you're going to bunk with and travel all around the world. And a lot of these guys can be found, in the blue chip natural history productions, and the BBC's, anything has planet in it. There's also a scholarship called the Rolex Scholarship, where a lot of these guys have gotten that diving experience and camera experience out of the way. It's not doesn't limit us. I'm very open to working with anyone. I wish that there were enough projects where I could pull in a lot more folks and build a bigger, tighter network. But there's only, in terms of these projects, there's only a handful every year, 10, 20 at most. And so you got to go with guys who you're familiar with, who you've built a lot of camaraderie with, and who you don't have to worry about underwater, sometimes even being alone. Because like we talked about earlier, if the more people that are in frame, the more you're taking yourself out of that kind of natural history experience. You can't have five
Yeah.
safety divers in the water
Yeah.
and not have your eyes drawn to that. So there's a number of different considerations around how many people you want to have in the water. You need to have small teams, and you can't recreate. There's no green screens in 360. You need to go to the lakes and the oceans. Like, if you're going to film someone drowning, you actually have to find someone who can fake their drowning pretty well,
Yeah.
and handle that. And and we've done this before. You need to drive out a couple miles, find blue ocean, put weights on them, and they've got to be a really good swimmer. And there's no stunt divers. There's no safety divers around. Like, everything has to look real.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to be spending a ton of money trying to paint these people out.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And if you're doing like a 180 or like just a regular, like your one directional camera, you can hide everything behind the camera. But if you're doing 360, there's nowhere to hide.
There's no hiding.
Even the operator, I guess, that's the only thing you really want to paint out.
That's right. And some people don't have the money to. If they did have the money, they would do it. There's different tactics to making that easier in post, but you can't hide anything. Everything has to look real. And so a lot of these projects are natural history based. Manta rays, large animals, what would be considered dynamic megafauna. There are some cinematic kind of framed experiences with talent, but they're difficult. They're really hard. and people often, they're just difficult. And I only see maybe one or two a year, especially for underwater work.
So you're talking about narrative feature kind of work?
That's right. Yeah, maybe where a talent is pushed off a boat and is drowning, or dancers, or some type of like underwater ballet that's framed. And a lot of folks, when they look in these headsets, like, they don't want to see a pool wall. They want to see open ocean. They want to see features and ambient environments, and you can't recreate that. You can't green screen that.
No.
So
yeah,
everything has to be real to really capture people.
Especially if you're so immersed in like the headset and everything. Like, it's touching your eyeballs. There's no distance between you to kind of hide stuff.
That's right. Yeah. So run and gun is very typical in these types of shoots underwater, just capturing the naturals and wonders of the world. And there's a certain process and a certain type of camera that you have to build to be ready for that. You can't have all of the waveforms and preview displays and tethers that these guys in Hollywood have become accustomed to and have perfected in a lot of ways, which I have a lot of respect for. I wish we could do that in this space, but it's, at the very most, you can get comms and a mask,
right?
but you can't really bring the director down to the scene. They've just got to review this stuff later.
But what have you got coming up? Is there anything you can kind of allude to? I know you've probably got some highly secret stuff going on, but is there anything interesting coming up?
Yeah, we're building cameras. We've got large LED projects over the next couple years that are releasing all over the world, and we've got a few military projects as well with ROVs. So we're doing a lot more ROV work. I would look for Into the Now. I
Yeah.
don't know when it's going to come out. I don't know how it's going to release. I don't know what Michael Muller's going to do, but he's done some really groundbreaking work, and it was one of the most ambitious projects of the last decade in the 360 world, and I would just keep your eyes out for that whenever it hits.
Yeah, I will. I think there's a trailer on your website. I will link to that or embed it in the show notes for people.
Cool.
Thanks, Casey. It's been awesome.
Brett, thanks for having me. It's good to chat with you. It's good to be a part of this podcast and some of the other giants in the industry who I've enjoyed listening to your episodes. I really appreciate the time and look forward to speaking with you again.
You too, Casey. Thanks much, man. Thanks for listening, everyone. And as always, if you like the podcast, please subscribe. If you'd like to connect with us or just learn more about my guests, you can hit our website at theunderwaterpodcast.com or on Instagram or Facebook. Also check out our regular live streams on YouTube. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to know more about my underwater photography workshops and mentoring, you can find me at brettstanley.com. The Underwater Podcast is presented and produced by me, Brett Stanley, and our music is Neo by Oh Boy. Keep creating, everyone. I'll see you in the water.